All right, welcome back, everyone. Today's explainer is diving straight into an incredibly complex reality: the 7 distinct faces of unemployment in a developing economy. Now, you might be wondering, why should you care about this? Well, understanding these forces is absolutely crucial for grasping things like global migration, economic health, and honestly, the very future of work itself. So let's just get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this. To make sense of these 7 textbook types of unemployment, we're going to break them down into 5 easy-to-understand thematic layers. We've got the jobless reality, chronic and systemic issues, wasted potential and mismatches, shifts in time and tech, and rounding it out, the absolute open unemployment. Starting with layer 1, the jobless reality. Because, as you'll see, it is a whole lot more than just not having a job. In a developing economy, joblessness is literally a multi-headed hydra. It rarely just means a temporary dip in the business cycle. As our source material points out, unemployment in these nations is this incredibly complex web of systemic limitations, educational mismatches, and shifting economies. Unlike developed nations that might just be battling cyclical downturns, developing economies are fighting massive foundational battles. Keep that in mind as we explore our first specific types. Moving right along to layer 2, chronic and systemic issues. This is where we look at deep-rooted limitations and hidden joblessness. So our first phase is structural unemployment. And these aren't just minor hiccups, right? They're baked right into the fabric of the economy. This happens when a massive chunk of people simply can't find work because the jobs literally do not exist. It's caused by chronic, deep-rooted limitations in an economy's production capacity. There's this huge, urgent tension here. The rate of capital formation, meaning building the factories, the infrastructure, the equipment, is painfully slow, but the population is booming. The economy physically cannot create jobs fast enough to match the rapidly growing labor force. Now, what's really interesting here is how we can visualize these structural shifts in the real world. Think about technological automation completely sweeping through factories. Or look at how consumer demand shifts entirely, like the mass move away from physical newspapers, which just completely wiped out print jobs. Add in globalization, outsourcing jobs to places with even lower labor costs, and you can clearly see how these structural shifts leave willing workers totally stranded until the economy can expand its baseline capacity. Okay, I want you to keep this stark number in your head: 0. It is the defining characteristic of our next phase of unemployment. In economic terms, we're talking about zero marginal productivity. And that brings us to disguised or hidden unemployment. This is what happens when way more workers are engaged in a job than are actually required. It's kind of like having 5 people hold one single paintbrush. If you remove a few of those workers, the total output wouldn't drop even a tiny bit, meaning their marginal productivity is exactly 0. You see this predominantly in rural family agriculture, where small landholdings force a whole family to work the same tiny plot, or in super crowded informal street vending. People look busy, for sure, but they aren't actually adding to the total economic output. Which leads us to layer 3, wasted potential and mismatches. This explores what happens when education and capacity just do not align with reality. So what happens when a developing nation actually manages to educate its workforce, but the economy itself just isn't ready for them? Well, you get educated unemployment. It is exactly what it sounds like: joblessness, specifically among matriculants and higher educated people. Our source attributes this to a really rapid expansion of educational facilities, paired with a faulty, highly traditional education system. A system that puts way too much emphasis on general education rather than practical, vocational training. So, you end up with an education that is completely disconnected from the actual jobs available. The source material actually hits the nail on the head here, calling it a massive waste of scarce human capital resources. And it really is a tragic irony. A developing nation spends its precious, incredibly scarce resources to educate and train its people. But because the economy can't utilize those specific skills, all that time, money, and potential just evaporates. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast between 2 very closely related issues. On the one hand, you've got educated unemployment, someone with all the credentials, maybe a master's degree, but absolutely no job at all. But on the other hand, we have our fourth phase: underemployment. This person actually has a job, but they're contributing way below their true capacity or qualifications. We're talking about an overqualified engineer who's forced to take a low-level data entry job, or a part-time worker who's desperately seeking full-time hours but is held back by the market. So that covers structural capacity and education mismatches. But it naturally makes you wonder, what happens when the seasons change or when the robots arrive? Let's move to layer 4 and see how this builds. Shifts in time and tech, left behind by the calendar and innovation. Our fifth phase is seasonal unemployment. This one's pretty straightforward. It happens because certain industries just do not operate year-round. People get work for a few months, but are totally jobless during slack periods. To put that into perspective, think about agricultural farm laborers. They might be working nonstop during the monsoon planting season, but have zero work during the winter. Or tourism workers who struggle immensely during off-peak seasons. Then we have our sixth phase, technological unemployment. It's the job losses that come directly from adopting labor-saving, highly efficient capital techniques. While these new machines are absolutely amazing for output, they literally displace human labor. Workers are left scrambling to adapt to a landscape that just doesn't need their manual input anymore. Let's break down these examples because they show exactly how these everyday innovations translate into hard economic realities. Look at technological unemployment in banking. The widespread adoption of ATMs severely reduced the demand for human bank tellers. In manufacturing, automated factory robots replaced human workers right on the line. And then back on the seasonal side, we see farm laborers completely out of work when the winter slack periods hit. Bottom line, time and technology wait for absolutely no one. Which brings us to our final layer, layer 5. The absolute open unemployment, the baseline reality of joblessness. This is open unemployment. Think back to our zero motif from earlier with disguised unemployment. Well, here, the amount of available work is absolutely zero. These are workers who have literally nothing to do. They are completely ready, willing, and able to work at the prevailing wages, but they're forced to remain jobless. They are entirely shut out because the work simply does not exist. So, the crucial point is figuring out who actually faces this absolute state. Open unemployment is found largely in urban areas. It hits those fresh graduates entering the market that we talked about earlier, as well as seasonal factory workers during their off seasons. It is the ultimate manifestation of structural and seasonal issues coming together to leave a worker with zero opportunity to earn a wage today. All right, so how do developing economies actually fight back against all these faces of unemployment? Well, based on our source material, you can't just slap a Band-Aid on it. The solutions have to be foundational. It requires massive, long-term economic development. It means actively expanding the economy's production capacity to actually catch up with rapid population growth. And it absolutely requires significant urban job creation to pull people away from the overcrowded, disguised unemployment of rural agriculture. But I want to leave you with a pretty massive dilemma to ponder. If developing economies have to rapidly expand their capacity to solve unemployment, how exactly can they do that without leaving their massive unskilled labor force entirely behind in the wake of hyper-efficient technological automation? It is one heck of a balancing act. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time as we continue unpacking the fascinating dynamics of our world.